There is a number that explains everything. 4,000 pounds of gold. That is what the Roman Senate agreed to pay Alaric in 407, compensation for the campaign he had mobilized his army for, marched to the agreed position, and then sat waiting while Rome decided it didn't need him after all. 4,000 pounds of gold for his time, his men, his logistics. The year of his life he had spent preparing for a war that the Western Empire had commissioned and then cancelled. The Senate debated whether to pay it. One senator, a man named Lampadius, whose name survived because of what he said in that chamber, stood up and called the payment not compensation but tribute. He said in front of his colleagues that what Rome was doing was not hiring an ally. It was paying off an extortionist. He was not entirely wrong. He was also not entirely right. Because the man waiting for that money had spent 12 years trying to be part of the system that was now debating whether paying him was beneath its dignity. He had fought Rome's wars. He had buried Rome's enemies. He had crossed the Alps in winter twice, to make a point that Rome kept refusing to hear. The Senate paid. And 2 years later, Stilicho was dead, the money was gone, and Alaric was standing outside the walls of Rome for the first time. Not to destroy it. Not yet. Rome hired him, used him, cancelled the contract, and then had his children killed. What Alaric did next wasn't rage, it was the most patient, calculated response in the history of military strategy. 3 times he could have destroyed the city. 3 times he chose not to. This is the episode where you understand why that matters. Subscribe, like the video, and let's get into it. 408 DC Stilicho had a plan. The plan was elegant in the way that plans built on too many moving pieces are elegant. Impressive on paper, catastrophic when one piece fails. The Western Empire was bleeding from every frontier simultaneously. The Rhine crossing of 406 had turned Gaul into a war zone. Britain was producing usurpers faster than Rome could execute them. Africa was unstable. The court at Ravenna, Honorius had moved the capital from Milan to the swamp-surrounded city on the Adriatic, specifically because swamps are harder to besiege than open plains, was paralyzed by factional politics and the emperor's fundamental uselessness. Stilicho needed to stabilize the West. To stabilize the West he needed to deal with Gaul. To deal with Gaul he needed troops he didn't have. The troops he needed were in Epirus, under the command of a Gothic king who had been waiting 5 years for a title and was running out of patience. He sent for Alaric. The commission was specific. Move your army from Epirus to Epirus, northwest into the province of Noricum on the eastern edge of the Alps, positioned to cross into Gaul when ordered. In exchange, 4,000 pounds of gold, paid from the imperial treasury, and the formal military commission that had been promised and withdrawn and promised again for the better part of a decade. Alaric moved. He mobilized 40,000 warriors and their families, crossed the Balkans, and positioned himself exactly where Stilicho had asked him to be. He waited for the order to advance into Gaul. The order never came. What came instead was a letter from Honorius, written from Ravenna, informing Stilicho that the campaign was cancelled. The political situation in Gaul had shifted. The usurper Constantine III was consolidating rather than advancing. The emergency that had justified hiring Alaric had, by the court's assessment, passed. Alaric was sitting in Noricum with 40,000 people and no paycheck. He sent a message to Ravenna: "Pay me what you owe me or I come south." The Senate of Rome met to discuss the payment. The institution was a shadow of what it had been. Not the body that had governed the Republic, not even the body that had rubber-stamped imperial decisions in the height of the empire's power, but a collection of wealthy aristocrats whose primary function was ceremonial and whose primary concern was preserving their estates and their dignity in roughly equal measure. They debated whether 4,000 pounds of gold was too much to pay a barbarian. Lampadius said what he said, that paying Alaric was not diplomacy but tribute, that it set a precedent, that Rome did not negotiate with threats. His colleagues listened. Some agreed. The aristocratic instinct that had governed Roman foreign policy for centuries, the instinct that said Rome did not pay, Rome demanded, was deeply embedded in the room. Stilicho argued the other side. The payment was not tribute. It was a military contract, honored like any other. Alaric had performed his part. He had mobilized, marched, and positioned his force exactly as agreed. The cancellation was Rome's decision, not his. The money was owed. The Senate voted to pay. 4,000 pounds of gold left the treasury and went east to Noricum. Alaric received it. He acknowledged it. He did not consider it sufficient. The title was still missing, the permanent arrangement was still a promise rather than a document, but he accepted it as a signal that Stilicho was still operating in good faith. He was wrong about that. Not about Stilicho's intentions. Stilicho genuinely intended to deliver on his promises. He was wrong about how much time Stilicho had left. August 22, 408. The date is precise because what happened on that date was recorded by everyone who witnessed it and everyone who heard about it, because what happened on that date changed everything. Stilicho was executed. The coup had been building for months. The Eastern court had always hated him. Half vandal, too powerful, too independent, too capable of making decisions that the Eastern emperor couldn't control. The Western court had factions that resented him for the same reasons. And Honorius, who had spent his reign being managed by his father-in-law, had finally found advisors willing to tell him that managing could be ended. The charge was treason. The specific accusation was that Stilicho had been planning to use Alaric's army to place his own son on the Eastern throne, to use the Gothic king as a tool for a dynastic coup. The evidence was thin. The political convenience was overwhelming. Stilicho was arrested in a church in Ravenna, dragged out and beheaded. His son was killed the same day. Then the killing expanded. The families of Gothic soldiers serving in the Roman army, men who had fought for Rome for decades, whose loyalty had never been questioned, who had been integrated into the imperial military structure as deeply as any Roman unit, were massacred across Italy. Women, children, the elderly. The purge was systematic and deliberate, carried out by Roman soldiers against the families of their own colleagues. 30,000 Gothic warriors serving in the Roman army watched their families be killed. They walked out of their units and went to find Alaric. He received them. His army, which had numbered 40,000, was now larger. And the last Roman general who had understood what he wanted and why was dead in a church courtyard in Ravenna. Alaric moved south. He did not move in rage. That is the thing that the sources, read carefully, make clear. He moved with the same cold deliberation he had always moved with. Objectives defined, options calculated, the political situation assessed with the precision of a man who had spent his entire life studying the empire he was now marching against. His objective was not destruction. His objective was negotiation from a position that Rome could not ignore. He had tried negotiating from Epirus. He had tried negotiating from Noricum. He had tried negotiating from inside Italy during the first invasion. Every time the conversation had ended the same way: promises, delays, the implication that recognition was coming, and then the quiet withdrawal of whatever had been implied. He needed a different position. He chose Rome. In the autumn of 408, Alaric's army surrounded the city of Rome. Not Milan, not Ravenna where Honorius was sitting in his swamp, but Rome itself. The eternal city. 1 million people. The symbolic center of the civilization that had spent 12 years refusing to acknowledge him. The siege was not an assault. He did not attack the walls. He cut the supply lines, the roads and river traffic that fed the city, and waited. Rome began to starve. The Senate sent negotiators. The negotiators told Alaric that Rome would fight rather than submit. Alaric asked them how many soldiers the city had. They said they had a very large number, implying an army too great to count. Alaric told them the thicker the grass, the easier it is to cut. The negotiators went back to the Senate. The Senate paid enormous quantities of gold, silver, silk, and pepper. The sources list the pepper specifically, which tells you something about late Roman luxury economics, left the city and went to the Gothic camp. And Alaric, in exchange, lifted the siege and opened the roads. Rome breathed again. And Honorius, in Ravenna, surrounded by his new advisors and his chickens, refused to negotiate. 409 DC. Alaric tried one more time to have a conversation. He sent terms to Ravenna, not demands for destruction, not ultimatums designed to humiliate. Practical terms. Land in the Danube provinces for his people to settle permanently. A military title. An annual payment in grain. The kind of arrangement that the empire had made with federate groups before and would make again. Honorius said no. His new chief advisor, a man named Olympus who had organized the coup against Stilicho, had constructed his political position on hostility to the Goths. Negotiating with Alaric would validate everything Stilicho had tried to do, which would suggest that Stilicho had been right, which would suggest that executing him had been a mistake. The logic of the coup required the war to continue. Alaric marched on Rome a second time. This siege produced one of the strangest episodes in the entire story. Unable to get Honorius to negotiate, Alaric did something no barbarian king had done in living memory. He appointed his own Roman emperor. A Greek bureaucrat named Priscus Attalus, the city prefect of Rome, technically qualified, completely without real power, was elevated to the purple in a ceremony that everyone present understood was theater. The theater had a purpose. Attalus, as emperor, could issue the orders that Honorius refused to issue. He could grant Alaric his title. He could authorize the settlement in the Danube provinces. He did. On paper. The paper meant nothing because Attalus controlled nothing. Not the army, not the treasury, not Africa, whose grain supply was essential to feeding Italy and whose commander had declared for Honorius. Within months it was clear that the puppet emperor couldn't deliver what Alaric needed. Alaric deposed him. He sent his imperial regalia to Honorius as a gesture. He was not interested in who sat on the throne. He was interested in one thing: the title. Honorius in Ravenna still said no. 410 DC. Alaric was camped north of Rome, attempting for the third time to open negotiations with Ravenna, when a rival Gothic commander named Sarus, a personal enemy, a man with his own grievances and his own relationship with the imperial court, attacked his camp without warning. The attack failed, but it ended the negotiation. Sarus was connected to Honorius's court. The attack, coming at the precise moment when Alaric was attempting diplomacy, was either coincidence or instruction. Alaric decided it was instruction. He turned south. For the third time in 2 years his army surrounded Rome. But this time the calculation was different. This time there was no negotiating position to establish, no pressure to apply, no conversation to force. The conversation was over. Honorius had made his position clear through 12 years of broken promises, through the execution of the only Roman who had understood the situation, through the massacre of Gothic families, through the rejection of every reasonable term Alaric had ever offered. Rome was going to open its gates. On August 24, 410 they did. The sources disagree on how. The most consistent account says the Salarian gate was opened from the inside, by slaves, possibly Gothic slaves who had been inside the city, who opened the locks in the night while the garrison slept. The city that had not been entered by a foreign enemy in 800 years was entered. Alaric's army was inside Rome. 6 days. That is how long the Goths were inside Rome. 6 days in the city that represented, to everyone alive in 410, the permanent center of the world. What they did in those 6 days, what they took, what they destroyed, what they left standing and why, is the story of the next episode. But understand what happened the moment the gates opened. In Bethlehem, St. Jerome, the scholar who had translated the Bible into Latin, who had spent his life inside the civilization that Rome represented, sat down and wrote that he was speechless. That the city which had conquered the world had itself been conquered. That the light of the world had been extinguished. In Hippo in North Africa, a bishop named Augustine began to think about what it meant that a city could fall. That earthly cities were always temporary. That the only permanent city was the one that existed outside time. He would call it the city of God. The book that came from that thought would shape Western civilization for 1,000 years. All of it, the theology, the philosophy, the entire intellectual framework of medieval Christianity, began with a Gothic king who spent his life asking for a title and was refused.